On the slopes of Diamond Head, this is Kapiolani Community College. Kulia ika nu'u, strive for the highest.
Aloha. Welcome to the Legal Environment of Business, BLAW200. I'm Ben Carroll. Well, we're proceeding through the Uniform Commercial Code. Last time we took a look at Article 3, Negotiable Instruments, and we'll be moving on into Banking Area, Article 4, and a little bit of Article 3 again today. So as always, let's take a look at our review and see what we covered last time and what your understanding and recall is. Okay, what are the requirements for a negotiable instrument, and what are the different kinds of instruments? So you recall that a negotiable instrument needs 6 different things. So it needs to be in writing. This is one of the contracts that has to be in writing. It needs to have the signature of the maker. And you recall signature is any kind of mark that indicates that the person wants to be bound. It has to be an unconditional promise to pay. So it needs to be I will pay, not I owe you or I will pay you if, that sort of thing. Okay, it needs to be at a fixed time or on demand. In other words, when presented, it needs to be to a specific person or to order or bearer. And those are the terms of negotiability that makes it a negotiable instrument, and it needs to be in a fixed amount. So if you have those 6 things, then you have a negotiable instrument, or as also known, commercial paper. And that's something that can be negotiated, used as money, or to obtain credit. What are the different kinds? Well, we divided those basically into 2 different areas. So we talked about drafts, which are 3-party negotiable instruments with a drawer requesting that a drawee make payments to a payee. So the kinds of drafts that we looked at were the trade acceptances, which a lot of businesses use between buyers and sellers, and the one you're more familiar with, which are checks, a specific kind of draft that we'll look at in a little more detail today. The other major area were notes. So we talk about promissory notes. Those are 2-party instruments where one party promises to pay another party, so the maker of a note and the payee. And we also looked at a specific kind of note, which is a certificate of deposit with a bank. Okay. So what's the most common kind of draft under the UC and how many parties are involved? Well, the most common, the one that you're familiar with, is a check. And there are, again, 3 parties there. Okay, you have a signed document that says, I will pay you $50 on October 30. What is this, and can you enforce it? Well, this is a 2-party instrument. It's a promissory note. I promise to pay you. So can we enforce it? Well, we'd have to look back at our 6 things and see, is it signed? Does it give us a date? Does it have those 6 different requirements? And perhaps in this instance, we would be concerned with, I will pay you. And you recall we might need to explain who that is. And if it's at October 30 and not a year, the question would be, are we assuming it's this year? Do we know when it was signed? That sort of thing. So it can be quite short and be an effective negotiable instrument, but we have to look and see that it has covered those 6 requirements. Okay, what's the effect of an endorsement, and what are the different kinds of endorsement? So you recall that an endorsement is simply a signature. Okay, and a signature is, in essence, saying, pay this. So the different kinds would be, and let's use a check. That's familiar to us. Different kinds of endorsement would be a blank endorsement where we simply sign our name on the back. So the check is written to us. We sign on the back. That's a blank endorsement. And as we talked about, that's like leaving the check blank or changing the payee on the front to say cash or anybody or blank. So anybody can use that because we've now turned that into a bearer instrument. In other words, whoever's holding it or bearing it can use that. Another type of endorsement is the special endorsement, where we're saying pay this to a specific person. So we would say pay to the order of, and now we have changed the payee. So again, this would be like on the front, crossing out the payee and putting in a new payee. So we're saying pay to this particular person. Okay, and then we have restricted endorsements, where we would be restricting what can be done with it. So our signature is saying pay in a certain way or to a certain place, or deposit, etc. And the most common one there is where it says for deposit only, and that would indicate it's restricted for deposit, so a person finding it would not be able to negotiate it. And then finally, there were qualified endorsements where we would say our name, no recourse, and that means we're actually taking ourselves out of the liability chain, and we're saying take it as is, can't come back at me. It's kind of like no comebacks here. Okay, so those are our different endorsements. And what does it mean to be a holder in due course, and why is this important? Well, a holder in due course is somebody who receives a negotiable instrument, and they receive it in good faith, they've paid value, and they're not aware of any defects in the instrument. So, in effect, we think of them as sort of an innocent party. They're not aware of any problem with it, and so they can end up with actually more rights than the person that transferred it to them. So they can, because they're an innocent party in this chain, and because we want to maintain the negotiability and the transferability, we may protect them and give them more rights than actually the person that originally wrote it or transferred it. Okay. So that is an important status, to be a holder in due course. Okay, now how is a negotiable instrument discharged? Well, this is similar to when we were talking about discharge of a contract. So there's some obvious ways. If in fact it is paid, that would discharge everyone if it's paid in full. If it's paid by a secondary person, then the primary may still be on the hook, but the secondaries are discharged. If it's discharged by acquisition, in other words, it's received back by the person that issued it, then everyone except the holders in due course would be discharged. And if it's collateral or certain recourse that one of the parties would have has been damaged, then it may be discharged with respect to those people because their rights have been changed. So this is a way that we would, in essence, get rid of or pay or fully complete a negotiable instrument. Okay, well, we're going to look a little more in detail at the banking industry. Article 4 covers quite a bit about the banking industry, and we're really going to focus on the part that's of interest to you as a consumer and a business person, as opposed to some of the regulations that deal mostly with banks interacting with each other. So we'll be looking at some of the major banking regulations, again, as they apply to consumers. We'll be looking at types of checks, the bank's duties to you, your duties to the bank. We'll talk about forgery and alteration a little bit. We'll touch on electronic funds transfer, and then hopefully at the end we'll talk a little bit about banking safety and some issues of fraud, etc., and probably talk to some folks about that. Okay. Well, the banking relationship is a contractual relationship, so you are contracting with your bank for them to provide certain services to you and, in effect, to act as your agent. And so the contractual arrangement that you set up with them, the bank contract, will have certain requirements. And in addition to that, there are a lot of kind of fill-ins that the UCC Article 4 does. So it establishes part of your relationship, and the rest is as agreed with your bank. So, of course, that contractual agreement can differ between banking institutions and financial institutions, but they will be complying with Article 4 of the UCC. Okay, it puts you into a creditor-debtor relationship. So for the most part, you provide your money to the bank, and then they will pay it at your direction thereafter. Now, that can change a little bit if, in fact, you overdraft, in which case now you're the debtor to the bank until that's taken care of. And in addition, we'll be talking in a couple sessions about agency, and the bank acts as your agent. So you will direct them to pay the payee, and they're acting on your behalf. So in that instance, they are your agent. Okay, so Article 4 just basically establishes the framework within which this banking relationship occurs, and it will talk about deposits, how the checking system works between customers and the bank, and it will also touch on electronic funds transfers. And there will be many additional banking statutes and regulations, and we'll only touch on a few, but of course there is a lot of additional information on the website as well. Okay, so what's the bank's information duty? Okay, well, they are taking care of your business as an agent, and they need to let you know exactly what their duties are and what your responsibilities are as well. So almost all banks are going to give you a monthly statement in some fashion. Some will return checks. There's different ways they're going to handle these responsibilities. But they need to tell you the basics, the interest rate paid, any fees they have, what the statement covers, that kind of obvious sort of thing. Okay. With respect to interest-bearing accounts, they'll need to tell you what the interest is, any penalties, anything you have to do to obtain that rate. Legislation has now indicated what they need to do with respect to making your funds available. So there's a certain period of time after which, when you put an instrument in, deposit a check deposit money, that it needs to be available to you, and that's going to be dependent on whether or not the checks have to clear. And there is information on the site about that whole process of checks going to the other banks and Federal Reserve and all that sort of thing that we won't track where your check goes, but there are regulations saying when your funds have to be available, and of course it would be dependent on whether it goes in as cash or it's a check that needs to clear other banks. Because what may happen is your check may go through banks and then initially not be honored, in which case it would back up, because those are kind of provisional acceptances along the way. Okay, so just a quick look at that. Local checks should be available within 1 business day. Non-local checks 5 business days, and this would also apply to using an ATM not from your institution. And then there are certain exceptions if you have a brand new account or particularly large amounts of money, that sort of thing. Okay, so there's a little bit of review as we'll go back. This is a draft, so this is a negotiable instrument with 3 parties. In the case of a check, we're talking about the drawer is the customer who has the account, in other words, the depositor. We're talking about the drawee, the person receiving the request to pay, and that's going to be the bank. And then we're talking about the payor, and that's who we put on the check that we want to have paid. So again, the drawer, the customer, the depositor is requesting the drawee, the bank, to pay our money out to a payee. Okay. Obviously, if we do not have sufficient money there, we'll talk about what happens, but they're not obligated. Their obligation is to pay our money, not their money. Okay, so what are the different types of checks? We're all familiar with the personal and business checks. Okay, so this is where we are responsible for the availability of funds, and if there aren't sufficient funds, then we will have an NSF situation, in other words, not sufficient funds. So that can be stamped on your check. And we have some other terms that you're probably familiar with as well. So if your check bounces, we refer to that as a rubber check, and that means boing, comes back because there's not enough money in the account. So we'll look at that, but of course, if you don't have funds, you are directing them to pay your funds, and they can't pay your funds if there's not enough there. Okay, and because of this inavailability of funds, sometimes you'll be requested for a check that's more guaranteed. And so there are other types of checks that would not bounce. And so we'll take a look at what those look like. Okay, so a cashier's check is actually where the bank is the drawer and the drawee, so they are promising to pay their funds. And so in this instance, you pay the bank to issue this, so that is a service. And for them to, in essence, guarantee the payment because they're paying their funds, we will pay a premium or a fee for that. And this check now is going to be accepted probably in more places because they know that we're relying on the bank. We're not relying on your specific account. Okay, so if somebody has a bad credit history or they have used checks before that did not clear, that they didn't have funds for, they may be requested to come up with either a cashier's check from a bank or, as we'll look at in a minute, a certified check, because these kinds of checks are relying on the bank's funds rather than yours. So it's a safer bet for the recipient, for the payee of this kind of check. Okay, so in many respects, certified check for most of us feels like a cashier's check, same sort of thing, but this has already been accepted by the drawee. So the bank has already said, we're assuming liability for this. So you recall we talked about accepting when we were looking at drafts last session, and this check is pre-accepted. So again, it's going to be the drawee has already said the funds have been set aside. It no longer has anything to do with the person who purchased it and submitted it to the payee. It's now on the bank. Okay, so both of these kinds of checks will get away from the problem of insufficient funds on behalf of a person or company issuing a private kind of check. Again, most folks are familiar with the traveler's check. This is widely accepted as a cash substitute. You don't have to present it to the drawee bank. It's accepted, or the drawee company. It's accepted many, many places. And before we had the electronic credit cards and the EFT, this was a very, very common way when someone was traveling, hence the name traveler's check. So these would be accepted all over the world, and a very good way to have a cash substitute that did protect you. And if you haven't used these, and again with credit cards and debit cards, not so much, but the interesting feature about the traveler's check is you would sign it when you first got it, and then you would countersign your same name, the drawer. You would countersign it in front of the person receiving it, the payee, so that they could compare the signatures. So that lent its negotiability, made it more evident to folks and why it was accepted all over the place. So the example you saw is the American Express, and originally that's where they made their fortune because they were early on accepted many, many places. Now, of course, different companies will issue traveler's checks as well. And again, a lot of us are using credit cards, so not as critical as they once were. Okay, so some check components. Let's take a look at our check. So you're all familiar with this, and what do we know? We know this is a negotiable instrument, so we know that it has to have the 6 things that we've talked about and we looked at previously. So we're going to have who's paid to the order of. We have to have the payee. It is a demand instrument, but we will probably put a date as well. Okay, we're going to have to sign it, the drawee. We have the drawer. Okay, various bank numbers and the memo line. And you recall on the memo line that it doesn't really make any difference what you put there, because you can say non-negotiable and full in payment in full and various things that will not affect the negotiability. In fact, calling it non-negotiable simply won't work because a check is negotiable. So whereas you could change other types of instruments and make them non-negotiable by stating it, you can't do that with a check. So again, you're familiar with most of these pieces, but let's talk a little bit, and we'll look at fraud again, but just a couple of things here. Recall that when you're writing the amount, you would need to put it over towards the dollar sign so somebody cannot alter it. So if somebody could actually put in another number in front of it, they could turn 100 into 1100, 1100, or something like that. Same when you're writing the written amount. Again, that's to confirm. It's harder to change the words than it is the numbers, but you should make sure at the end that you make sure that whole line is full. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about fraud, but there's some very professional check alters and ways of changing checks, so we do need to be careful of that, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. Okay, now the bank has a duty to pay a check if you comply with their terms of your checking account and you have money. So that's their duty, is to act as your agent and pay your money as directed. Now, they can refuse to pay in a number of instances. So we've already talked about one. If you don't have enough money, insufficient funds, they're not going to have to pay that. Okay, if you it hasn't been endorsed properly, they don't have to pay. If a check is stale, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, a stale check means a check that is presented 6 months after it's written, and they don't have to pay that. Okay, they don't pay if you have stopped payment appropriately, complying with their requirements. Okay, they don't have to pay if you've omitted something material like the amount. They're not going to pay a blank check, so to speak. And they also are authorized to not pay if they have some questions about the check itself or the person that is offering the check. So they have some discretion if they think that there's a problem with either the check or the person offering the check. Again, if you think about it, partly this is for your protection as well, but they are within their rights to question that reasonably. Okay, now a couple of instances is where the bank has an option to pay. So they don't have to pay, but they can pay. So if you have an overdrawn account, they don't have to pay. They don't have to pay money you don't have, but they can. So in some instances, you may have overdraft protection, which essentially is the bank offering you credit. They're saying, we think you're good for it, so we're going to pay it even though you don't have funds, and then we're expecting funds to come in. So if you had a late salary coming in or something of that kind, particularly if you've arranged ahead of time so you have this overdraft protection, you're in good shape. But a bank could do that anyway. But again, their option. If you don't have the funds, they don't have to pay. Okay. Now, a post-dated or predated check, antedated, a post-dated check, you might be saying, I don't have funds now, but I know I will have funds, so when I write it out, I'm writing it for 2 weeks hence when I get my paycheck. Now, they can pay that unless they're advised. They can pay it as soon as somebody brings it in. So unless you tell them, don't pay this check until the date, it's their option to pay it when somebody actually takes it in. So somebody could take it in early. You, of course, would tell the payee, please, there are no funds, so don't take it in until next Tuesday. But if they did take it in, the bank could pay it. So it's not an absolute protection to put that on the check, because that's their option. And a stale check. So again, a stale check is a check that's being more than 6 months and we are trying to cash it. And many banks will say, too late, stale, we're not going to pay it. But again, it's the bank's option. So they could pay a stale check. And herein lies a problem. If you make a payment to somebody with a check and they don't cash it, then they contact you 6 months later and say, I have a check and my bank won't cash it, so you need to reissue another check. Okay, what would be the problem if you reissue another check? Well, now they have 2 checks, and conceivably they could cash both. They could go to an institution that would cash a stale check, and now you paid it twice. So that could be a problem if you don't receive back the first check, and we'll talk about obviously some other things you can do, but that's one of the issues. But these are instances where it's the bank's choice. They can pay or not pay. Their choice, not yours. Okay, wrongful dishonor. We used the term dishonor or honoring last session, but dishonoring means they refusing to pay. And if they wrongfully do that, then they may be liable for the actual amount that wasn't paid, but there may be other fees and liabilities that you've incurred, and in many instances they would be liable for that as well. So if you get a bounce check charge from someplace else, or the business charges you because you have given them a bad check, or there's some kind of other fines or whatever that happened, the bank may be responsible for that as well. Okay, now the instance where we've got a check out and we, for whatever reason, either it's stale and we haven't gotten it back, perhaps it was reported that this check has been destroyed or lost, but we don't want to have two checks out there, or for some other reason we do not want this check to be paid, we could ask the bank to issue a stop order, okay, or a stop payment order. So what that is we're instructing the bank, this has been put out there, this has been negotiated, and when it comes back, we don't want it paid. So there is going to be a fee for that. So we would tell the bank, do not pay this. And we need to give them enough notice. Okay, we can give them oral notice, which is going to be good for 2 weeks. And we need to get them written notice as well. Now, if we wrongfully issue a stop payment and the bank stops, of course, the liability then is on us for stopping the payment, not the bank. Again, they're simply following our instructions, acting as our agent. So if we have a debt and we stop our payment, then we may incur our liabilities ourselves. Okay. Now, generally, if you do issue a proper stop payment and you've met the requirements and the bank pays, then they're going to be responsible for the actual damages that result. Okay. Now, what happens if there are checks out there and the drawer becomes incompetent or dies? Okay. Now, the bank can still be paying these until it gets notice of the death or incompetence and has a reasonable time to act. Okay. And they can pay until they get a stop payment. They can continue to pay checks drawn on or before the date of death. So they can pay those unless they get a stop payment. Okay, now what kind of instruments are going to be invalid? Obviously the first of these kind of makes sense. Forgery, and when we talk about forgery, we're generally talking about the signature of the drawer, okay, endorsement on the back. We're talking alteration, which they're changing, and often we're talking about changing the amount, although we could change the payee as well. And then finally, we're talking about omitted information, so an incomplete instrument. And you saw previously that the bank can refuse to pay that, but again, we need to look at what the liability is in these instances. Okay, so when a bank accepts a check, they can require whatever kind of ID they want, okay, because they're going to be responsible for the paying, and for the most part, if they pay improperly, it comes back on them. So it's up to them to figure out what kind of identifications, what kind of authentication they want, because they're protecting their own liability. So again, they can do pretty much as much or as little as they want. And we've seen recently where you do the fingerprint sometimes if they're not familiar with you, that sort of thing. So they are implementing things to protect themselves. Okay, they can have different rules for customers and non-customers. So you probably had instances where you would try and cash a check written on another bank, and if you're not their customer, they don't have to accept that. They can refuse to pay that. If you're their customer, you have a contract with them and they will be taking your checks. May be an issue how long it takes to clear, but they're going to take your check, but not for a non-customer. Again, no contractual relationship there. Okay, now with a forged signature, and again, we're generally talking about a forged signature of the drawer. Usually the bank is going to be responsible for that. Okay, so if they pay over a forged signature, then they're going to have to reimburse the drawer's account. And their relief, if any, would be going after the forger, either criminally or civilly. Okay, so it's going to be on them generally. And why is the bank going to be responsible for a forgery? Because the bank are the experts. And you recall in the past we've talked, if we're dealing with a professional or somebody with a high level of skill or experience or expertise, then we're going to hold them to a higher standard. So we would expect that the banks are the professionals, the pros at detecting forgery, alteration, fraud, etc. And so the liability is going to be on them. We are hiring them to handle our money because they're the experts. Again, we'll talk a little bit more about that, but that's the rationale, and it's similar to what we've looked at in the past, where if it's somebody's profession, then we're going to hold them to a higher standard. Okay, now if, however, you have as a customer, as the depositor, as the drawer of the check, have done something that led to or made it easier for a forgery, alteration, or fraud, then it may be on you. So if you are negligent and do something, then it's possible that you would be responsible. Okay, so what sort of things would cause the customer or the drawer of the check to be responsible instead of the bank? Okay, well, if you think about it, what would make it easy for someone to forge or wrongfully cash a check? Okay, well, one thing is if you leave this blank, if you leave the payee blank, then you have created an instrument, a bearer instrument. Okay, so you have not completed a valid check. Then anybody can put their name in, and how would the bank know? So if you leave that blank, you're out of luck. How about if you leave the amount blank? Same problem. Somebody could put in an amount. If you leave both blank, good luck with that. But even if you give it to a particular person and they alter it or they put in an amount, so you don't want to be giving blank checks out, obviously. Similarly, what if you signed it in pencil, etc.? It might be found that you're negligent enough that you would be responsible for that particular forgery. Okay, because you have done something that made it easy. You have not done what a reasonable person would to properly protect your checking account. Now, there are actually some tips, and we may get to some of those, because the check alters and forgers are quite sophisticated. And again, we already mentioned that you want to be sure that you don't leave any space in the amount, because people can change that, and they're very clever. I have posted some pieces of a book for tellers, which gives examples of how they change numbers, change names, change a lot of information on the check, and it's almost art how that's done. So you can take a look at that, and it will put the scare in you a little bit about making sure the lines are complete and that everything's done just right. Okay, alteration. When we talk about alteration, we're talking about they have changed something on the check. So frequently it's going to be the amount. Sometimes it may be the payee. And when a check has been altered in that fashion, particularly as to the amount, the bank can pay the regular amount, but any amount they pay over what was properly there, they're responsible for, as opposed to you. But if you write a check in a certain amount and then it's changed, the original amount you would be responsible for. Now, as I said, the banks are the ones that need to be on the lookout for this, and so that's why tellers are trained what to look for. Some of you may be familiar that the check washers use acetone, and they can clean off signatures and they can clean off amounts and change them. So again, there's some real professionals out there that are changing checks. Just a quick aside is that check usage in Europe is gone very much, been very reduced. Again, they're using electronic cards even more than the United States, and they've actually passed some measures that make checks less negotiable. They're actually discouraging check use, so it's considerably less than we have in the United States. Okay, bank statements. So in addition to the responsibilities you have to use reasonable care in your checks, you need to be looking at your bank statements. The reason is that if you get copies of your checks and you look at the amounts out and it's different from what you have issued, you have a responsibility to let the bank know. So you need to review that and see if there's something unauthorized, because you would be the one that know what you've authorized. So again, at the first level of defense, the bank's checking and looking out and is going to be responsible for altered or forged instruments. But the second level of defense is that the customer should be looking and making sure that monies aren't going out that they have not authorized. And if you don't do that review, you may be responsible, particularly if something is regularly happening. Okay. I had an instance where we represented a ward that was not able to take care of their own finances because of a disability, mental disability, and we would give them an allowance. They were able to handle, day-to-day stuff. And we actually, our client changed some of the amounts a couple of times, but of course we noticed it, and since we notified the bank right away that we're not doing that, the amount is not that, then we were not responsible. The bank took care of that because we had properly notified them. Okay, so what are our obligations? Again, we've just talked about this. Obligation to take care when you write your checks. Obligation to look at your monthly statements and make sure that if there are any mistakes that you're or forgery or alteration, that you let them know. And of course to keep sufficient funds to cover the checks that you do write. Okay. Now, electronic banking is changing a lot. So as we said, checks are becoming considerably reduced. So more and more, what are you using? Well, you are using your bank card or your credit card. So this is the way we do most of our transactions now. And so a lot of new regulations are coming up, and this is obviously a very developing and changing area of the law. Most people have some exposure to either online bill paying, to getting money out of ATMs, to doing credit card or debit card sales over the internet, all of these types of things. So this is obviously the direction we're moving, and so there are additional laws. And we looked at a couple of those last time, UCITA and UETA, and again, there is posted information on those particular laws. But one that's quite important is the Electronic Funds Transfer Act. So this regulates the cards that we use, how they're used as evidence, how they have to show on bank statements, that sort of thing. So again, there's a lot of information on responsibility and how to use these cards to protect ourselves. One of the most important provisions, and I did want to highlight this, is what happens if your card is lost or stolen. So if it's lost or stolen and used, what is the responsibility of the bank and what is the responsibility of you as the customer, depositor, card holder? So I'll share with you that something happened to me that kind of pointed out what happens here. I had a wallet that was stolen. Same evening I was going in for a medical checkup. So I'm in a hospital. The next morning, my wife comes and says, the bank called and asked about your credit card. At that point, I was not even aware that my wallet had been taken. And what had happened is the bank had noticed that there were transactions that didn't seem to be the kind of transactions I usually did. So with computers now, they have kind of a profile of their customers. So if they see something out of the norm, for example, a customer going to 3 or 4 different gas stations and getting gas all on the same day, or if they notice internet or foreign transactions when they haven't seen that before, then it kind of raises a red flag. And that is what had happened. So within about 12 hours, the bank had noticed something unusual and contacted me before I had even noticed that my wallet was missing. Okay. What if the bank hadn't noticed? And again, they're not obligated to do that. They're doing that to protect you and themselves. What if they had not noticed? Then hopefully within a couple of days, 48 hours, 2 days, I would have noticed that my card was gone, and I would have notified the bank. It's either lost or stolen, depending on whether I knew, And so I want to let you know so that you will not make any payments. And if I do that within 2 days, then my liability is limited to $50. In many instances, the bank wouldn't even charge you that, but in any case, you're limited to that. Now, if it takes you 2 months to let them know, then your liability can go up to $500. So if you don't let them know at all, or don't let them know within that 60, within the 2 days up to 60, then your liability would be limited to $500. And if you don't let them know and it's more than 2 months, whatever comes out of your account is your problem. Okay, so again, you have to demonstrate some responsibility yourself in keeping track. And if you do that, then the bank will be on the hook. But if you do not, then your liability will increase as the longer the period of time you don't notify them. Okay, I just wanted to note that there are crimes involved as well. We're talking about civil liability, but recall that we're talking about these can be crimes as well. So obviously forgery, we could go after the person civilly, but it's also a crime. Check kiting may be a term you're not familiar with. And bouncing a check may or may not be a crime. If you are, many places, if you are writing a check and you know there are not funds and there won't be funds, then you have also committed a crime. But I did want to briefly identify check kiting you may not be familiar with. Check kiting is actually relying on the float. So there's a period when you write a check before the check is going to go through the check process that's described online and end up at the bank, the drawee bank. So if you're continually trying to get that kind of free credit and writing it when you know there are not funds there, it's called check kiting, and that can be a crime. Okay, I just wanted to use the term phishing, and we're going to talk to some folks about banking fraud and internet banking fraud. And phishing is probably a term you've heard of, and it means like fishing for bank information and numbers, etc. is where the term came from. And so this is where, and you get a lot of emails. This happens typically. You get emails that purport to be from your bank. They're telling you that various things are happening, crises are happening, and you need to confirm this or protect that. And so a lot of this is happening online. And so we'll take a look at how to protect yourself on that, because again, this is an area that's rapidly developing, and the crooks are right up there in the forefront. Okay, so let's chat a little bit about how to protect ourselves from that sort of online fraud. Aloha. We've been talking about banking and particularly about some of the security issues and concerns with online banking. We're here with Hal Corcoran, who teaches some security classes at IT at KCC. Why don't you tell us a little bit more about your background?
Okay. As you said, I teach security as well as networking and PC hardware classes at the KCC in the IT program. Before I began teaching, I spent 10 years at the University of Rhode Island as a Linux and system administrator. I also spent several years after when I first came to Hawaii as a network administrator. So I have a pretty wide IT background. But security has always been an interest of mine. Okay, well, the first tip would probably be not to trust anything that comes over the internet. For example, when you might receive an email that claims to be from some authority, such as your bank or IT support for your bank or for some company you work for, it is very easy for people to forge the to, the from, the subject, any of those headers in the email. So you can't trust any of that information just because it claims to be from your bank. It's probably very unlikely that your bank would send you email and ask you for any personal type of information. So the first tip is probably just to be wary and not trust things at first view that come over the internet. Phishing is a type of social engineering, which means it's like a confidence game or a con job. It's all about gaining someone's confidence and getting them to expose something to you that they wouldn't ordinarily expose to just a stranger. So the person pretends to be from your bank, or pretends to be a tech support person, or pretends to be the Prince of Nigeria, who is asking for something from you, help to transfer money, or they might say that they need your password in order to perform some maintenance on your account, or they need your banking information in order to verify something. So they're just trying to trick you into exposing some information that you wouldn't ordinarily do. And this is really common, and a good deal of people actually do fall for it. As an example, a few years ago, my ex-wife received one of these emails that claimed to be from her bank asking for her credit card information. And she was a little naive about online security, and she went ahead and went to the site and put in all of her credit card information. It wasn't until after she had entered the information that she called me at work and told me what she had done. And I told her she should call the bank, cancel the card immediately, which she did. But in the time it took to call and get the card canceled, the card was already maxed out. It was all charges for computer equipment, all in Amsterdam. So as soon as they got the number, the perpetrators must have gone right out and just charged as much equipment as they could before the car was canceled, which they probably knew was coming soon. There are some special forms of phishing that target certain groups. For example, there's what we call spear phishing. Spear phishing is the same concept as phishing, but it targets a narrower group. For example, at UH, we had some spear phishing attempts that only targeted UH email addresses, and they claimed to be with IT support for the university, and they were asking people to give their passwords so that some maintenance could be done on their account, or their email account would be canceled if they didn't respond with their passwords. And a number of people, I understand, actually did give up their passwords, and then those accounts were used to send out spam and other types of invalid emails, and those accounts had to be canceled. Well, changing the password often is definitely a good idea, but it becomes difficult sometimes to keep track of so many passwords if you're continually changing it. So you need to find a balance between what you can keep track of, so you don't have to be writing it down. The worst thing you could do is write your password down on a Post-it or something. You need to strike a balance between keeping track of a lot of passwords and changing it at least periodically. The thing that makes a password, there are two things that make a strong password: the length and the complexity. The length is obvious. The longer the password is, the harder it's going to be to guess or to crack. Complexity has to do with how many different possibilities there are for each character within the password. The more possible characters, then the harder it is to guess, the harder it's going to be to crack. For example, ATM machines use a 4-digit PIN number. For each one of those 4 characters, there are 10 possibilities from 0 through 9. Right? So that means that in a 4-digit password, there are 10 times 10 times 10 times 10 possible passwords or possible pins that could be used. That's only 10,000. That's only 10,000 possibilities. A computer hooked up to an ATM machine could guess through those 10,000 possibilities in probably a minute. So the more complex the password, the better. The way to make the password more complex is to use combinations of numbers, lowercase letters, uppercase letters, and special characters. If you add in all of those different types of characters, that's really over 100 possibilities for each character within your password. And then you use a minimum length These days there's about 8, so 8 to 10, maybe up to 12 characters of 100 possibilities each. That's should be a pretty secure password that it would take a computer some time to guess and go through. The other rule of thumb is to avoid anything that could be found in a dictionary, because there are programs that will go out and just guess words against a dictionary. They'll have a dictionary with a few 100,000 words, and they'll just guess one after another, hoping that they'll hit on one that will work. Cryptography or encryption is a way of encoding or scrambling information so that it's only readable by the intended receiver. And most banking websites, I'm sure all banking websites, use encryption to protect the traffic between your browser and their server, so that someone who's intercepting or sniffing network traffic in between isn't able to capture any of your sensitive bank account information or passwords or anything like that. Typically, websites use secure socket layer encryption, which is actually been replaced by something called transport layer security, or TLS. Although people still use the term SSL, the two are very similar and work almost the same. They use something called public key encryption to set up the connection between the client browser and the server and exchange an encryption key, and then they use that key to encrypt all of the traffic during the banking transactions. As long as you're logged onto that site, they're encrypting all of the traffic so that no one who might intercept it should be able to read or know anything about your passwords, your banking information, or anything that you're doing on that site. There's also a third mechanism I just like to mention briefly that banking sites use. Is called a CAPTCHA. It's that little picture you see sometimes that has some characters that you need to type in. They're a little bit blurry. The idea of that, it stands for a completely automated public Turing test to tell computers from humans. The idea is that a computer cannot read those blurry characters very easily, but a person can. So when you enter in that text, you're proving to the site that you're not a computer program, you're a human that's logging into the site.
These are like the wiggly letters or the different colors.
Exactly.
And that sort of thing.
Exactly. That's difficult for a program to read, but it's fairly easy for a human to read. Generally, if anyone were to request my information by email, my first instinct would be to get on the phone and call them and ask them, "Is this really you asking for this information?" And I would suspect it's not. I mean, they know, the banking sites all know about these phishing scams, and so they're not going to play into it. They're not going to ask you to send some kind of information through email. Chances are that if they need that, they're going to call you or use some other means to get that information from you. It's very, very unlikely that they're going to ask you to send anything through email. So I would always be suspicious, and if I had any doubts, I would just call up the sender and ask them, "Are you the ones that sent this email?" Digital signatures are related to public key cryptography, which uses key pairs that have a special mathematical relationship, so that you have a pair of keys, and whatever is encrypted with one key of the pair is decrypted with the second one. It's like the translation piece. It's what's being combined with the information in order to scramble it or encode it. So what happens is you have this pair of keys. You designate one as your public key, and you publish that so that anyone who wants to know it can know it. The second one you keep private, and you never share it with anyone. So if I want to sign a message, and send it to you so that you can verify that it came from me, I can sign it with this private key that only I know. When you receive the message, you can then decrypt it with the public key, and the fact that it decrypts with the public key means that it had to have it encrypted with my private key, which only I have possession of, therefore it had to have come from me. Can be faked, but you can usually verify the encryption. If you look on the browser, they usually have some kind of icon that will pop up. If there's actually encryption being used, there'll be like a little lock maybe in one corner, or sometimes if you look at the page information, they'll have security information, and it will actually show what type of encryption is being used. So if you have any doubt about the encryption being used, you can verify, and you should have at least 128-bit encryption being used on any banking site or site that has any kind of sensitive data. And if you see something less than that, you might want to be suspicious. The S really stands for the secure socket layer encryption that we talked about earlier, which is actually modern sites actually are the TLS now that's replaced the SSL, but works in a very, very similar way. And it just means that the encryption has been set up between the browser and the server, so all of that traffic is being encrypted, and so it doesn't verify that it's using very strong encryption though. So you might want to look at the page info and verify that you're using 128-bit or better encryption. But any banking site will usually use pretty strong encryption, so usually you don't have to worry too much.
Okay, well, I hope that was useful information to you about how to protect yourself. Just kind of a little bit of a summary we'll look at. So these are kind of the things that we've covered about how the banking system operates and what you can do to do your part, acting as a reasonable customer and fulfilling your duties with respect to your bank contract, and really just common sense, making sure that your transactions are secure when you're on the internet and doing online types of things. So, okay, well, as always, there's a lot more information on the website, so please do that in the exercises if you're taking for credit, etc. So look at the Laulima site and the additional banking information there. Okay, and this has been Carol saying next time we're going to be looking at secured transactions. We're going to finish up with the UCC Article 9. We'll be looking at other kinds of creditor remedies, such as liens, and we'll also talk a little bit about bankruptcy. So that will wrap us up with the UCC Uniform Commercial Code, and also kind of end our creditor-debtor kind of area. So I'll be seeing you next time. Aloha.